A special. Here's John Ware.
This is Lady Porter, Conservative leader of Westminster Council. She sold off its cemeteries and they fell into ruin. Now another controversy threatens to embroil her. Panorama has uncovered disturbing evidence that Westminster Conservatives have misused millions of pounds of ratepayers' money for political advantage. That's Lady Porter, The Pursuit of Power, a Panorama special, tonight, 9:30.
Wogan's guests in half an hour include actress Imogen Stubbs and the ex-Los Angeles cop turned best-selling author Joseph Wombaugh. That's after our roundup of the day's events in the South East.
Good evening. The headlines from Newsroom South East. Tories under fire over the sale of the cemeteries. Unions dig in over the future of Cowley. And the lives and loves of Terence Stamp. The controversial sale of 3 cemeteries by Westminster City Council for just 5p each has again returned to haunt its leaders. At a public hearing called by the district auditor, Labour councillors accused Lady Porter and senior colleagues of bullying officers in an attempt to push through the sale. Stephen Gardner reports.
Back in 1987, this cemetery in West London was sold along with 2 other graveyards to a private property company. The asking price, 15p. 2 years on, and its former owner, Westminster City Council, is in the process of attempting to buy all 3 sites back, but with the present landlords reportedly asking in excess of £5 million, it could be an expensive process for the ratepayers. Certainly it's already taken its political toll on Tory-controlled Westminster City Council, who've already been subject to 3 inquiries, which have variously described the cemetery sales as seriously defective, as well as accusing the authority of maladministration. As for today's public hearing at County Hall, it's provided Labour's opposition group on Westminster City Council with an opportunity to start a process they hope will lead to certain Tory councillors being surcharged or possibly even being disqualified from holding public office for their part in the cemetery sell-offs. In an attempt to establish willful misconduct on the part of the ruling Tory group, today's public hearing has heard accusations of an ideological obsession to sell off public assets at any price, and unreasonable pressure being applied to council officers to steamroll through the cemetery sales without considering options that would have guaranteed their upkeep.
I think we've made a very strong case at length this morning and this afternoon to show on numerous occasions that Lady Porter and her close Conservative colleagues were given warning after warning that selling the cemeteries would be very difficult, and if they were sold, it would lead to asset stripping and poor maintenance. And again, we've demonstrated that the warnings were given, but the warnings were not heeded, and that's why the fiasco took place.
We are not saying, no, there were no mistakes. Yes, there were mistakes, but we've learnt from them, and certainly there's nothing to justify the political circus that we see engineered by the Labour Party.
Do you think it's a forgivable mistake?
I think it's a forgivable mistake. I think that any mistake where people honestly admit that there's been a mistake and that they can show, as we have shown, that they have learned from that mistake and that their policies are sensible policies and that in future their policies will not be affected by the mistakes that affected the earlier decision, I think that's perfectly forgivable.
But for those with relatives buried in the cemeteries, the issue is neither political nor economic.
Absolutely gutted that they could actually sell my mother and father for 5p. To me, it's worse than slavery.
The public hearing into the cemetery sales is expected to continue for the next 3 days.
And later tonight, there's a special Panorama investigation of Lady Porter's record as leader of Westminster Council. Lady Porter, The Pursuit of Power, includes unpublished evidence of her awareness of the potential dangers of selling the cemeteries. Thousands of workers at the threatened car plant at Cowley in Oxford have been hearing their union's plans to keep the factory open. Austin Rover wants to close the Cowley South Works next year, but the workforce believes it's still viable and are trying to interest foreign buyers. This from Riz Khan.
It was the day workers at Cowley who turned up this morning, an estimated 7,000 people according to the union leaders who addressed the gathering. Last July, they had to break the news that Cowley South Works would be run down by the end of 1989, and only one model, the Rover executive car, would be made at Cowley. Today, union leaders told the workers the demands they would make at a meeting with management tomorrow. It was the announcement last week of a joint venture between Rover and Honda at Swindon that sounded the death knell for Cowley, according to the Transport and General Workers Union, the largest at the plant.
What sort of response do you expect from management?
Well, it will be probably typical. They have all their plans made. We are the last to know, as usual. Their employees, the people who have made all the wealth, will be the last to be told, because they will consider their responsibility is to one group only, the shareholders. The employees, as far as they're concerned, are expendable.
At this stage, there's no talk of a strike, but it certainly hasn't been ruled out.
One thing I can assure you, the Cowley workers are not renowned for ducking and diving. We are renowned for standing their corner and fighting. We believe there's never been a more important issue to fight on the issue currently facing us.
These are the people that want to put our youngsters out of work quicker.
What are you talking about? What have you done? What are you talking about? We want to do something to keep the place open.
But the clear majority of workers back the union demands. The Cowley issue is starting to receive more attention at the level of both local and national politics.
Well, as far as Cowley's concerned, we want assurances from the company that the viability of the plants at Cowley is to be sustained by a commitment to produce a new generation of models there. The workers of Cowley have proved that they can deliver quality, productivity and good industrial relations, and that they deserve better than a kick in the teeth for their commitment to the company. I want to see their commitment reciprocated by management and by the government.
And now with more news from around the South East, here's Stephanie.
The government has announced a £100 million grant to help the inner London boroughs take over education services next year when the Inner London Education Authority is abolished. The grant will continue for 5 years on a reducing scale. Our Westminster correspondent David Brewer reports.
The Education Secretary Kenneth Baker said the boroughs had told him they needed help in paying for education in inner London. He said the grant would help them reshape services and squeeze out the overspending inherited from Ilya. But he warned that if the London boroughs didn't provide an efficient and effective education service, then the public would want to know why. The exact form of the grant and the way it'll be shared out will be announced in the autumn.
The Inner London Education Authority has dismissed the grant as being £200 million below what's needed. Ilya claims boroughs will have to cut educational services by 20%. Commuters face another strike on the Underground next Wednesday. The date's been set by the drivers' union ASLEF. The biggest rail union, the NUR, is meeting now to consider calling a strike on British Rail on the same day. Talks between unions and management are due to be held tomorrow.
ASLEF were quick to set the date of the next strike earlier today. NUR leaders are still meeting to decide whether to go ahead on Wednesday. Union leaders will meet management for talks tomorrow for the first time in 4 weeks. The two sides will again discuss the sticking points: London Underground's action stations plan and the ASLEF claim for a £64 a week increase for the drivers of one-man operated trains. Management will also offer a 7.2% pay increase to all 20,000 staff. Next week's strike should again coincide with a national rail stoppage. The good news for London's commuters is that bus crews have accepted a 9.1% pay offer, although a separate dispute with engineers and maintenance staff continues.
Police say passengers should avoid closed or empty compartments after a woman was attacked on a Victoria to Ramsgate train. Detectives are investigating possible links with the case of Deborah Lindsley, who was murdered on the same line last year.
The victim of the attack left Victoria on a train like this at 10 minutes to midnight on Monday. She was travelling in a first-class compartment. But unlike Deborah Lindsley, who was killed in a closed compartment, she did have a means of escape down a corridor.
In a case like this, of course, we will look at the possibility of the two matters being connected. But at this moment, there is no evidence to suggest that the two incidents are in fact connected.
By the time the train left Penge, it was after midnight. With the British Rail strike just starting, there were only 2 other people in the whole carriage. One of them was her attacker, the other was too far away to come to her rescue. As the train slowed at Bromley South, the man jumped out, ran across the rails and climbed over a wall. British Rail, meanwhile, have stressed that the old closed compartment carriages are being phased out by 1991 and warn people to travel in the company of other passengers wherever possible.
Identical twins from all over the South East have helped start a trust to raise funds for research into diabetes. More than 300 pairs of twins have been taking part in tests into the cause of the disease. Here's Amanda Harper.
The world's largest study of diabetic twins started in 1966 at King's College Hospital, looking at 300 cases where one had diabetes and the other not. Today, some of those who are taking part in the programme met to launch the trust, which needs an endowment of £500,000.
What we're trying to do is to raise enough money to endow this research, well, indefinitely, at any rate for a good many years, so that we know that it can go on, because it's quite certain that these twins are going to produce interesting and, I think, important results for many years yet.
With the trust launched, it's hoped that doctors will soon find a way of preventing diabetes.
For the last 2 days on Newsroom South East, we've been looking at the controversial issue of poverty and whether in 1989 real deprivation exists. The debate's been sparked by Social Security Secretary John Moore. He suggested that absolute poverty is a thing of the past. Even the poorest people are now substantially better off than ever before. In a moment, we'll be considering those comments in a studio discussion. Before that, a reminder of our 2 films.
We lived in 3 rooms at the top of the house, and every drop of water had to be carried up and carried down. There was no sink, no washing facilities.
If you couldn't work, you couldn't earn, and you ended up in the workhouse.
People don't know what poverty is these days, I don't think.
Have the children ever gone hungry? No, I don't think so. Have you ever gone hungry? Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid so, yeah, to feed them. What's it like here in the winter?
Bleak. When there's a lot of snow, it's rather bad, because people can't get down and we can't get out.
It's a sort of grinding sort of poverty, which seems to rub off on the children of the family.
At the end of the day, have you got anything to look forward to at all? No. Nothing.
You feel a lack of choice. You feel that options that might have existed 30 or 40 years ago have been closed down to them now. And they feel to some extent as if society has left them behind.
We invited John Moore to take part in this programme to answer some of those arguments, but his office said they didn't believe his appearance tonight would be useful. In his absence, I'm joined by David Willits, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies, an organisation whose thinking has often influenced government policy studies. And also Chris Pond, the Director of the Low Pay Unit, and by Martin White, Chief Executive of the National Association of Citizens Advice Bureau. David Willits, if I could turn to you first, do you think people know what poverty is these days?
I think that the meaning of the word poverty is changing. And clearly there are poor people. It'd be silly to deny it. But now somebody who's on unemployment benefit, who's out of work, will be receiving a level of benefit roughly equal to what a man in work on average earnings was collecting after the war. So our standards have been rising, and that's in a way a good thing as society becomes more prosperous. But the old ladies that you interviewed on your programme were quite right when they said our measures are very different from what they were 50 years ago.
Are you saying people have no right, really and truly, to describe themselves as on the poverty line?
Well, I think you have to avoid some of these definitions of poverty, which mean that any measures that you take to alleviate it appear to make it worse. Some of the people who say there are millions in poverty take as their measure the level of supplementary benefit, or people close to supplementary benefit, which has the perverse consequence that every time you raise the value of benefits, you claim to find there are more people in poverty. We clearly mustn't define poverty like that. There are people who are on very low incomes who find it difficult to make ends meet. But even the poorest members of our society, the people who are on supplementary benefit or income support, are likely to own their own television, and probably a colour television nowadays. That's very different from 50 years ago.
Chris Pond, would you say that was true? And do you believe real poverty exists nowadays?
I think it's very clear that real poverty does exist, and some of the shots from your film show that. We've got many millions of families who cannot afford the basic necessities of life, let alone some of the so-called luxuries which David just referred to. But we do have to measure poverty in relation to the society in which people live. And if most people, as they do in Britain today, do have a colour television, then it seems reasonable that those families who are at the lowest levels of income themselves should have a colour TV. And
but you can't describe that as poverty, can you?
You can describe it as poverty in the sense that those people very often do without things which most of us would take for granted. And you have to measure those standards in relation to society. On John Moore's own department statistics, there are 9.5 million people who live on an income at or below the supplementary benefit level. And to put that in perspective, for a family of 4, that's £78 a week plus housing costs. Now it's easy for those of us living in comfortable Britain, and particularly for John Moore on £1,000 a week himself, to dismiss those people as being in poverty because they have a colour TV. The reality for them is very different.
Martin White of the CAB, what is the reality in your experience? What kinds of people are coming to you and saying they're suffering real hardship?
Many people are coming and clearly are suffering real hardship. I'm not concerned about John Moore's dictionary definition of absolute poverty. I'm concerned with real people, with real financial hardship, who haven't got the basic income to meet the essentials of living, food, fuel, water, housing, and that kind of thing.
But there are benefits, aren't there? There are benefits they can claim.
That's right, but they're not always sufficient. One of the things we find for a start is that people don't always take up the benefits, and one of the main functions the Bureau serve is identifying benefits which have not been taken up and seeing that they get applied, and that's not been helped by the Department of Social Security not getting the message through to people, and we try to do it in their place. But quite apart from that, benefits aren't sufficient always in themselves. There's often a shortfall between benefits and what people need to survive in anything like a reasonable state.
Chris Bond, could the climate be changed regarding benefits? Or will there always people who just feel, well, basically they have their pride and they don't want to admit they're poor?
I think that's a very important point, that there are many people who don't wish to turn to the benefit system in order to provide themselves with a decent standard of living. Many of them are working full-time, but still find themselves and their families in poverty. The only solution that this government offers them is to go along to the Department of Social Security and claim benefits such as family credit and housing benefit, and many people say, no, thank you very much, we'd rather do without that sort of assistance. People need their pride, they need their dignity and their independence, and they need to be able to say, we will manage on our own, but we shouldn't penalise them for that.
If this programme were followed by advertisements, it might well have on it an advertisement funded by the Department of Social Security urging people to take up the new family credit. We've all seen those advertisements. That is a new benefit introduced by the government only last year, precisely to help people who are in low-paid work, the sort of agricultural workers that you showed on your programme yesterday.
So are you saying there's nothing that can be done for them?
No, I'm saying that something is being done, and that is the new family credit, which it helps people who are maybe earning £100, £200 a week who can be entitled to it.
That benefit is being introduced, David, at a time when the government is encouraging wage cuts for the very poorest workers, when it's actually pushing down the wages of those people that we're talking about. Now, people don't want to claim benefits. They want a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. They make their contribution, and they want to be rewarded properly for that. This government's policies are actually pushing people onto dependence on the welfare state. For all the talk about the dependency culture, it's actually John Moore and his predecessors who are responsible for putting many people in that position.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's a middle-class dream to buy up a derelict house for a pittance, renovate it and sell it on for a small fortune. That's exactly what one former architect is doing in South London. But he won't be using the profits to scramble further up the housing ladder. Instead, he's sending the money to Nicaragua, where thousands of people have no homes, derelict or otherwise. Duncan Kennedy went to meet him.
Nicaragua's revolution shook Central America 10 years ago today. It's withstood a decade of war against the Contras, but it's also produced remarkable advances in literacy and in health. Whatever its deficiencies, it was a revolution that inspired one man 6,000 miles away in Vauxhall, London. 5 years ago, the man known simply as Todd decided to do more than support the Nicaraguan revolution with words. He bought this old shop in Vauxhall for £18,000. For 5 years, he and his friends have struggled to do it up. Doors have come from skips, the floor from an old power station, and the kitchen sink from a chemistry lab. In all, they've spent £6,000. Now it's on sale for £200,000, and Todd is virtually giving it all to Nicaragua.
There was a possibility to go and work in Nicaragua, but I realised that in a way it would be, you know, by building a house in London you could raise enough funds to maybe build 50 houses in Nicaragua. So it seemed like a more useful thing to do.
Why give it all to something like this? Why not take it off and do something yourself?
Well, we're going to put a bit by until we've decided what, you know, hopefully to set up some other project, exactly what. I think at this stage in the game, a lot of people will be very unhappy if somebody started to hold on to the money. There have been too many people involved.
Following last October's hurricane in Nicaragua, most of the money raised will now go to help rebuild homes there. The house is now on the market, with its sale bringing to an end a remarkable venture.
Why would somebody want to do this?
Perhaps just to show that it can be done, I suppose, because there's a, you know, there is a myth that greed is the only possible motivation. Oh, probably a bit of an idealist, yeah.
In the 60s, the actor Terence Stamp was one of the hottest properties in the cinema. Beautiful and vain, he was hailed as the British James Dean. In the late 70s, he returned to the limelight in Superman and later in Wall Street. For a decade in between, he vanished from sight, turning to drugs and religion after the breakup of his relationship with Jean Shrimpton. Now he explains why to Cathy McGowan.
I was always terrifically kind of fussy and fastidious about everything when I was, I mean, for as long as I can remember. And then as soon as I started making money, I just kind of gravitated naturally to sort of quality things, you know. I was always really pissed off that my trousers got holes in the arse and my socks got holes in the heels. You know, it was just boring.
Where did your dad figure in all this, then?
He was a stoker. He got a job on a tug, and for a long time he was stoking. So he was just kind of, he was working like a dog, really, sort of making the money.
It's empty now, the river, you know, but when my dad was alive, it was a kind of real industrious stretch. He would have liked it today. He didn't like the cold mornings, you know, 5 o'clock starts.
I wonder what you'd have made of you then.
Yeah.
It was pretty traumatic when you started school. You didn't like it, did you?
No, I mean, I mean, first of all, I didn't want to spend all that time away from my mum.
Mm.
And my mum didn't, I mean, my mum cried sending me to school. She was just working. She thought she'd get arrested if she didn't send me to school. So she packed me off to school when I was 3. And I used to hang on the railing, say, please don't send me, Mummy, please don't send me, crying. And women would stop and say, oh, you wicked woman, you know. And then my mum would get embarrassed and drag me and take me shopping with her, which is what I wanted. Anything rather than go to school. I was also a bit of a clean freak. The galvanised bath used to hang on the wall outside, you know. Friday night it would come in. First one in, get 2nd-degree burns, and the last one in, you get pneumonia, you know what I mean? Curious thing about those tiles, whenever I'm having a dream that's going to be important, I'm always entering through this door. I'm always standing on those tiles. When I get inside, then I could be anywhere. Hello. Hi.
Oh, boy.
Do you want to come inside?
Sure. When I lived here, the door was here. The door was there, out into the yard.
Who altered it?
I don't know.
Who altered it? No.
What do you use that cupboard for?
Well, that cupboard gets used for everything.
That's right. That's how we used to use it. I always
felt really deprived because our bit of the yard was so big and theirs was so enormous. You know, they had like orchards and lawns and things. I grew up in the shadow of that stately home.
The face of the 60s happened. You'd taken over really where James Dean left off. What film in your life then did you think, I've done it, here I am?
I think after I went to Hollywood, and when I was received really well in Hollywood, that was for a film called The Collector. They made such a fuss of me, and I just thought, yeah, this is going to be my career.
So you had the career that everyone wanted, and you also had the girl that everyone wanted.
But then I had neither. You know, I'd lost Jean, and the 60s ended, and then I thought, oh, yeah, that was, you know, that was my moment in the sun, you know. Everything is always changing, you know, even somebody as exquisite as Shrimpton, who I would have actually staked my life on her love for me, you know, but it ended. I couldn't sort of make a commitment with her. You know, she was really the only girl I wanted, but I didn't want to lead a sort of traditional life, you know. And
do you regret that now?
Well, I can't say I regret it, because, in fact, her leaving me brought a kind of a dimension to my life that would never have happened. I thought, I'll make a completely new life. You know, I'll start a life that's so different. And then I went east.
And it will be, because Cathy will be back next Wednesday with part 2 of Terence Stamp. Now, some news just in. There's to be a rail strike also next Wednesday, called by the NUR, and coinciding with a tube strike called by ASLEF. Good news, tomorrow's weather will be lovely. Now, from Stephanie and from me, good night.